In this video, we are going to look at scientific questions. So by the end of this video, you are going to be able to do three things. Number one, you're going to be able to identify the three main types of scientific questions. You're going to be able to then classify questions as either verification, research, or experimental. And finally, you're going to begin to ask your own scientific questions. So let's start out with the types of scientific questions. There are actually three types, and we're going to dive into each one based on their characteristics. So there's verification, research, and experimental. So let's start with verification. Now, verification questions are basic questions that are asked to gain knowledge about a subject. So be really aware of that word basic. They are very, very basic questions. You might be asking about the characteristics or the properties of an organism or a phenomenon. And so you can answer these questions through observation or by collecting data. So these are kind of like your five senses. You're observing, but they are very, very easy questions to answer. So an example would be, is it hot in this classroom? You would go, maybe go look at the thermometer that's sitting on the wall in the room, or take out a thermometer from a drawer, measure the temperature, and then make a decision, is it hot in the classroom? So that's pretty easy to answer. Research questions are broad. They require prior knowledge about a subject as well as some explanation. And so, what you're going to do is use your prior knowledge to make a guess about what, how, and why something happens. And just kind of knowing with research questions, because they are quite broad, there is a lot of science involved, but these are not actually testable questions. They're just questions that you're going to dig into further and take a closer look at. So, an example might be, why is milk kept in the fridge? That's not an easy, basic question to answer. You do have to dig a little bit to find the answer, but you can't test it. You can't test why milk is left in the fridge. The final type of question is experimental questions. And so these are questions that are used by researchers to create a hypothesis, and testing's required to answer them. So, what you might ask, what happens to a system when certain elements are altered? So, if you change something, what happens to that system? These are testable. These are the kinds of questions you want in science, and the results of your experiment will help you answer your question. So, a good example here is, if a plant gets more light, that's sort of the first part. So, what we're changing, will it grow taller? And so we could set up an experiment where we have different plants that are exposed to different amounts of light, and then we're going to see, do they grow taller? And we could measure that with a ruler. Now, you can have questions, and you can essentially transform those verification or research questions into experimental questions. So you got to remember, experimental questions are the ones we want in science because they're specific, they're testable, and they're controllable. Experimental questions should have one dependent and one independent variable, and should have a related hypothesis. So if you need a refresher on variables, actually, that's coming up in the next lesson, so not to worry, but you'll learn a bit more about variables as we go on. So let's take the verification question, is it hot in this classroom? So if we wanted to transfer that into something that's testable and something that we could do an experiment with, we might ask, does the time of day affect the temperature in the classroom? That is something that we can actually measure. Now let's look at a second example. And so we can go back to that, why is milk kept in the fridge? That was a research question. And we can transform that into an experimental question by saying, how does temperature affect the shelf life of milk? So we could measure and control the temperature and change the temperature, and then look at how well milk stays or doesn't go bad, and measure the number of days that that the milk is okay. So you can, all kinds of questions are great, but we want to, when we're testing in science, to test those experimental questions. And really, you can take any kind of verification or research question and transform it into an experimental question. All right, so that's it for this video. Let's move on to the next task.